I want to say I very much welcome this debate, but I believe we need to formalise these arrangements, open up the discussion so that we can have a structured discussion on the North on a regular basis as part of the normal business of the Dáil. Unfortunately, the present arrangements don't allow for this, and there isn't sufficient time to deal with these important and complex issues. And what is equally unacceptable is the disgraceful way, occasionally, in which some TDs and parties have tended to use the North and issues arising from the recent conflict in a shallow, juvenile way, usually to attack Sinn Féin. And regrettably, some of Dr Martin's remarks today reflect this approach. I would like him to bring me into the North sometime and introduce me to the Sinn Féin provisional IRA communities that he has now discovered. You know, almost 4,000 people died in the recent conflict. Countless others died in other phases of conflict over the centuries. It's as gach pobble a hannig shade. The victims came from all walks of life and all sections of the community. They include members of the British State Forces, Gardaí and Defence Forces members, members of Republican organisations, unions, paramilitaries and civilians. The focus of political leaders and of this Dáil must be to ensure that there are no more casualties of political conflict on this island, that there are no more victims, that there are no more deaths. And that means we must understand the errors of the past in order not to repeat them. Ní raibh cogadh mai a riamháin, agus ní raibh séachán dana riamháin ach an oiread. The democratic position, to remind the Fianna Fáil leadership of it, is that the conflict on this island arose from the British government's colonial policy, and it's a moral and illegitimate claim to jurisdiction in Ireland. Following the Black and Tan War, the partition of Ireland, as James Connolly predicted, triggered a carnival of reaction and created two, not one, but two conservative states administered by two elites who entrenched their own power and privilege to the detriment of ordinary citizens. In the north, a one-party unionist regime controlled the sectarian Orange State with the aid of the RUC and the infamous B specials, and backed up by draconian legislation and the use of pogroms. The denial of basic civil rights and other measures, including the introduction of internment without trial, were the order of the day in both states. Discriminated against in employment, education, housing and voting rights, the nationalists in the 6 counties were treated as second-class citizens, and the Protestant working class were only marginally better off, but sectarianism was utilised by the British and Unionist establishment to separate citizens. And over this period, abandoned by Dublin, a Republican minority maintained heroic resistance at periods during the intervening years, but it wasn't until the 1960s that nationalists demanded our basic civil rights in an effective way. The campaign of the Civil Rights Association in the late 1960s for equality in housing, education, employment and at elections was met with a violent response by the Stormont regime. Savage attacks by the RUC and the B Specials, backed up by loyalist mobs, culminated in organised pogroms in August 1969 against Catholics in Belfast and Derry. And the violence saw the biggest population movement in Western Europe at that time since the Second World War. And then, as the Orange State began to crumble under the weight of democratic demands, British troops were more and more deployed. Promised reforms from London turned out to be purely cosmetic, and the British government's guns were turned against the nationalist population. And following the introduction of internment without trial, many nationalists who advocated reform within the 6-county state realised that the state was not reformable. The shooting dead by British soldiers of 14 nationalists in Derry on Bloody Sunday in '72, and the condemnation that followed this televised event left the Stormont regime in ruins. And last week, Taoiseach, you met another group of victims of British terrorism from Ballymurphy, and I very much welcome your support for them, for their campaign and for the other victims. And it was those responses by the British state to democratic demands that created the conditions for Republican armed struggle. It's also often forgotten that Sinn Féin was banned outright in the 6 counties between 1956 and 1974. Armed resistance, or support for armed resistance, was the only path that many saw open to them after the civil rights movement was shot and beaten off the streets, and that included members of the present government. The IRA that emerged in these years was one built by ordinary people out of sheer necessity because of the conditions in which they found themselves. And the nationalist areas of the north, as it had been previously in this part of the island at other times, the IRA was from the people, not some abstract idea. However, the British, the Irish government as well, used repression, first of all in the belief that it could militarily defeat the IRA, and later because it hoped to isolate or criminalise it. And I think we should focus on the abject failure of successive Irish governments to represent Irish national interest, and specifically to stand by those citizens under attack, how that contributed to the political conditions in which armed struggle was waged. From the "we shall not stand idly by" moment, the relationships of Irish governments with repressive British administrations grew more and more subservient. Militarisation of society in the north and the corruption of policing, the prisons, the judiciary and public life were obvious for decades. What was less obvious was the extent to which this adversely affected the people and the institutions of this state. From the early 1970s, many areas of public life here, the prevailing political culture, broadcasting legislation, the courts and the Garda, were gradually subsumed into supporting British counterinsurgency efforts. And many people here, good people, who wished to stand by their fellow citizens in the north and to stand for justice, were hounded and harried by the forces of the state. Many had their careers ruined. And while Irish governments did not ban Sinn Féin outright, they attempted to close the party down and harassed our members on a continuing basis. Surveillance of political radicals, the abuse of detainees in Garda custody, the activities of the notorious Garda heavy gang became a feature of political policing here, which only a tiny minority of journalists were prepared to question and expose. No jury courts and extremely anti-Republican ministers for justice gave the green light for such abuse and malpractice. And the overall effect, I think if we reflect on it, was extremely corrosive and included serious miscarriages of justice. The peace process, the fruits of which we all now enjoy, was made possible only when this failed policy of repression, censorship and political exclusion was abandoned in favour of a more enlightened approach in response initially to Hugh Adams. And remember the outrage, the artificial, contrived outrage when it emerged that John Hume and I had met. And remember how John Hume was vilified at that time for talking. The sterling work done by Father Alex Reid, by Dáil, Wilson and others created the way forward. And the Good Friday Agreement does mark a historic shift in politics in this island. It establishes a firm foundation on which it's now possible to continue building upon a future and for a future based on equality. For the first time since partition, this should not be gainsaid or taken for granted. There is an international agreement involving the Irish and British government, as well as nationalist, Republican and Unionist parties, on a way forward. And unlike the efforts that governments had concocted before, from Sunningdale in 1973 to the Anglo-Irish Agreement in 1985, the Good Friday Agreement was comprehensive, inclusive and addressed the issues previously ignored. It tackles constitutional issues, political and institutional matters, policing, weapons, justice, equality and more. And citizens in this state expect the government and the Oireachtas to have a proactive involvement in this process. And just as importantly, as I've said here many, many times, citizens in the north expect the same. As I've said to the Taoiseach previously, I want issues relating to the past, to the conflict, to be dealt with in a rational, reasoned, considered and informed way. But I also want to see the future discussed, planned for and created in an unthreatening and inclusive manner. I want to see this Dáil breaking out of a partitionist mindset. An Irish government that truly wants a united Ireland would understand that this means unity of the people, of all the people, including those who see themselves as British. This therefore requires an ongoing, continuous, energetic pursuance of every avenue to promote greater All-Ireland cooperation and understanding, and to build relationships on the basis of equality between all the people on the island. It means genuine efforts to outreach to the Unionists on the basis of equality. It also means undoing any of the ingrained partitionist thinking by policymakers here. I listened to an esteemed economist talking about trying to get an all-Ireland economy and cross-border economic measures and a border corridor being developed, and he said one of the difficulties was a lot of the policymakers were partitionist. Their thinking did not extend beyond the border. But there really was never a better time to plan and to deliver on an all-Ireland basis without infringing on perceived unionist sensitivities, where it's to our mutual benefit. The unionist, even the most fundamental unionist, will embrace measures to bring that about. I very much welcome the work that is being done, but much, much more needs to be done. The government, in its caution around some of these issues, does not differ at all from the Fianna Fáil governments, including the one in which Teachta Martin has served. We want to see, in Sinn Féin, and as someone who comes from the north, want to see all of these cross-border agencies, the implementation bodies, all of the other work expanded and intensified. I do think that the failure of the government, and I said at the time, Taoiseach, to you in advance, well in advance of the decision being made, that if you wanted to make the Narrow Bridge happen, that it would happen. And I do think that it's an opportunity that has been missed and will come to cost more when it comes back to be dealt with in the future. There's also, a need, and I say this every time I speak in these issues, to deal with the British government in an ongoing way. I've saw too many senior people from here almost tipping the forelock, being delighted to be in Chequers, being delighted to be in some great stately house. This is a sovereign government, notwithstanding the powers that have been given away, and it needs to act genuinely in the national interest in terms of the entire island of Ireland, including in what we perceive to be the interests of all of the people who live, particularly in the 6 counties. So the fact is, the British government acts in what it perceives to be its national interest. The fact is that not all aspects of the Good Friday Agreement and subsequent agreements have been implemented. It isn't that they don't know that they should have an inquiry into the murder of human rights lawyer Pat Finnegan. They know that. It isn't that they don't know the motions passed twice by this Oireachtas. It isn't that they don't know about collusion. They know. But unless an Irish government faces up to them on this issue, and it should be a matter of concern to all TDs and to every Irish government. Most recently, the whole issue of collusion has been detailed in a book, Lethal Allies, by Anne Cadwallader. And many of the people killed as a result of this policy come from here, including the victims of the biggest loss of life in any single incident, the Dublin Monaghan bombing. So all of these issues need to be dealt with. And I put it no better than this, that the government has a responsibility to educate the British government on these issues and to get it to engage on the basis of agreements that has been made. There's also a need to enlist our friends and the support of our friends internationally, including and especially in the USA. And it's no accident over the last few decades that Irish America and its representatives have been more informed, involved and progressive than successive governments here. And I thank our friends for that, and I welcome the ongoing interest, for example, of Bill Clinton, who's due to visit Belfast next month, and I thank President Obama and Vice President Biden for their ongoing work. The British and Irish governments must always be clear and unambiguous in their support for the ongoing process of change. If the British government is not focused and clear, then we can't expect unionist leaders to be positive. And I want to commend the work here of the Good Friday Agreement of the Oireachtas. I think it does lots of very, very important work. Tiny minorities who cling to the past must be rejected. That goes without saying, and Sinn Féin members do that every day of our lives in the 6 counties. Sectarianism must be tackled and has to be ended. And we should also look occasionally at some of the current scandals in this state, because it's my view that some of those are a product of the post-colonial condition that we find ourselves in. And building a real republic, therefore, is a benefit not just to some folks, but it's a benefit to everyone.
Thank you, Deputy Adams.
Just promise you one, just by me, I promise you. So the promise, and it's only a promise, of the Good Friday Agreement is for a new society in which all citizens are respected and which is based on justice and equality. And that must be advanced. Had I come into this chamber 20 years ago and said there would be ceasefires, that Ian Paisley would be in government with Martin McGuinness, that we would have all of this in place, I would have been, well, I wouldn't have been allowed in. But there you go. As John Joe McGarl found, and Addie Fullerton found to their cost. So, huge work has been done, but it needs to be continuously worked out. I could think of no better thing for this government to accomplish during your term or terms of office than to advance that process into the future, and that needs to be a major focus of every member of this Dáil.
Thank you very much.